Well, thank you for coming tonight, and happy Mardi Gras. Let the good times roll, huh? We could do that later. Anyway, you're here to learn about the Terminal Tower, and the way we're going to do it, I'm Rebecca McFarland. I was a career librarian, and I worked with Tom Pappas, who's also a career librarian. And I'm going to talk about, excuse me, the Terminal Tower, and then I'm going to toss it to him, and he's going to talk about the trains that use the Terminal Tower, because that's his specialty. I do the buildings, he does the trains that go into them. So between the two of us, hopefully we'll get it covered with everything you hope to learn. And we'll welcome questions like when I'm done, and then we'll change PowerPoints and then toss it off to Tom. So, Terminal Tower, how did it happen? Well, it was a long time ago. In fact, way back in the year 1879, Oris van Sweringen was born, long time ago. 2 years later, in 1881, Mantis was born as well. They were the fifth and sixth children to their parents, and unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, their mom died when they were only 3 and 5 years old. And so probably as a result, I don't know, I'm just making that up, but maybe that is why those two brothers remained as close could be, really for the rest of their lives. They were each other's best friends, and they worked together very well also. The two boys, they say, just complemented each other so well. They said that Oris knew how to make the snowballs, and Mantis knew right where to throw them. They were that good partners. Their formal education ended in the 8th grade, as was typical at that time, and they went out to work for various, jobs as young boys will have. But it was, if you fast forward to the 1920s, it was at that time when Oris and Mantis van Sweringen began their real estate career. And this is when things got real serious for them because, boy, they had the vision, the energy, and the courage to really make changes in the city of Cleveland. And they had a vision for a city that became Shaker Heights. And the way they would lay it out and the way they designed the America's first shopping area in Shaker Square. And they knew that in order to make a success of that, they knew that people needed transportation. So that if you were going to live in Shaker Heights and maybe kind of probably work downtown, you needed a way to get there. And as they frequently would say, population follows transportation. You're not going to live where you can't comfortably go somewhere else. And it's probably still true today. So they had an idea to move forward to a train system. And what they did, Tom will tell you more about this, but the Van Sweringens approached the Nickel Plate Railroad in order to negotiate a right-of-way for the Shaker Rapids. Now, chances are maybe we've all ridden the Shaker Rapid at some time to take you out to Shaker Square. And that too was their idea, but they needed a connection. And so they decided to purchase the entire Nickel Plate Railway. And they bought it from the parent company, New York Central. They needed a downtown terminal and decided to build one, a new, clean, nice-looking one, because the old Union Depot here that was at the north end of what we know now to be West 9th Street was looking old and dirty and messy, and they didn't want to connect with that old depot. They knew we needed a new one. The city leaders actually, at that time, really did have this billboard in downtown Cleveland because they didn't want people to get off the trains in downtown at the old terminal and judge the city by the looks of that, because the old steam locomotives kicked out a lot of soot and ash and whatever else they was belching out, whereas the Van Sweringen brothers thought there'd be a better way to do it. Now, the brothers knew that the center of town really should be a little farther south, not necessarily right on the lake. But at that time, there were 1,400 buildings in the area that today we know to be the Terminal Tower complex. 1,400 buildings. That was a lot of residences, none of which were anything worth talking about. A lot of businesses, 3 breweries, that was sad. They had to tear all that down. And the Van Sweringen brothers did so in order to make way for the Terminal Tower complex that they planned. Mostly those were tenement houses in that area, so for the most part they were doing the people a favor to move them out a little bit further into better housing. They began excavating for the Union Terminal on September 29th of 1923. It was a rough time for our country, and finances were a little risky at that time already. The Great Depression hadn't arrived as yet, but it was a tricky time. But the brothers felt that they were going to turn their vision of a dream into a reality right there on Public Square. And so all of these buildings that had stood there for so long were then torn down to make way for it. They began excavation, and as I say, when they started that in September of 1923, the only other thing on our planet that exceeded this was the building of the Panama Canal, as far as how much soil was moved to build the Terminal Tower, and that is huge. They had concrete piers that were sunk 250 feet into the earth and sand until they reached bedrock. So I've heard rumors, it's on quicksand, it moves. No, it's on bedrock. The Terminal Tower hasn't moved. It's there, and it's very sturdy, I should say, because they literally did move mountains of soil and went down to bedrock. Included in the grand plan was the building not only for the Terminal Tower, but also for a hotel, a medical building, a department store, and the main post office that we had at that time, as well as 3 additional structures. And they were all connected by a series of tunnels, and the tunnels are still there. The main post office was the final building to be built in the complex. This series of buildings is second only to Radio City Music Hall in New York City as far as the largest group of integrated buildings in the United States under one management. As I said, the work began in 1924 and the work was completed in 1934. Took 10 years to build all that at a total cost of $180 million. Sounds like a lot of money, but really not that much. At that time it was, that's for sure. But a huge series of buildings. This is the Hotel Cleveland that was the first one to be completed. So the entire complex, this is the terminal under construction, the entire complex covers 35 acres of land. That's a lot of acres of land, I should say, for the cluster of buildings. The railroad itself comprises 17 acres of that land. And the Terminal Tower has 52 stories and it stands 708 feet tall. In case anybody asks you, there are 2,200 windows. At least be glad you're not the one who's washing them. The observation deck is on the 42nd floor, and if you haven't been up there, do make a point to go. It opens, I think, Memorial Weekend, and it's kind of till Labor Day-ish, but it's well worth the trip. You want to go. You make reservations online. I think it's $5, but it's really an awesome view of the city. They say on a clear day it allows you visibility of up to about 32 miles away. Who measured that? I don't know, but I love those statistics. Dedicated in June of 1930, the tower was the tallest building between New York and Chicago until 1992 when our Society Tower was built at that time. Now we can't talk about the Terminal Tower without talking about the Van Sweringen's special suite of rooms. They were on the 14th floor, and the suite of rooms were really only open to invited guests. Tom and I were so lucky as to have been invited to tour them from the man who was the archivist for the tower. I don't know if he's still there anymore because now it is, of course, apartments and condos, but at the time they did have an archivist and he was kind enough to take us in there. The wood that's in the 14th floor of their suite of rooms was imported from the Sherwood Forest in England. Don't ask me why, but the Van Sweringen brothers, who were of Dutch ancestry, were real Anglophiles, and they thought anything English was just very fascinating. And so the interior decor, as well as the wood, are influenced by England. The amazing suite of rooms includes this great room that has an amazing fireplace at one end, and at the other it has a balcony where they would have musicians perform, you know, small musicians, no big orchestra up there, but that balcony is really lovely, and you can look over the great room where they would have had parties. The suite of rooms here was renamed the Greenbrier Suite after the Van Sweringen brothers were around, because of the designer who designed this room was the same one who designed the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia, which was owned by the Van Sweringen brothers and the C&O Railroad. When the brothers lived in this room, they used them for several reasons. Of course, there were parties and events afterwards, but while they were there, they used them for several reasons, most of which were business, although they did live here or stay overnight here from time to time. In these rooms here, they had meetings with other railroad executives. Daily meetings of their management team would be held in this room, which is directly looking over Public Square. Again, the woodwork is just beautiful, and a fireplace in each one. They did have a dining room, and in the dining room was hand-painted wallpaper. And this wallpaper is very unique. In fact, it's kind of odd. I don't know. I like things like this. But, you know, there are falcons painted in this wallpaper, and these windows happen to be right where the Terminal Tower falcons choose to nest. I wonder, did they look in the window and think, more falcons were home, and decide to nest outside these windows? I don't know, but what an odd coincidence. But it's lovely wallpaper that was, like I say, hand painted, that you can see there. Also, they had a smaller conference room here for a more intimate meeting of only 6 people, but again, beautiful fireplace. Each one has different kinds of marble in it. Just a gorgeous suite of rooms. This long, narrow hallway, again, richly paneled with wood, takes you down to the kitchen. Of course, they had to have a kitchen if you have a dining room, and this beautiful gleaming kitchen looks like it could have been built for modern purposes, but it wasn't. It dates back to 1934, everything in it, and it's very fully functional, just as if they were to have needed it today. The one thing unique was this panel here, which was an intercom, so that if they were in one of the rooms for a meeting and they needed more coffee or were ready for lunch or whatever, they could ring the bells, and then the chef would see where the light was lit and knew which room to go into to serve what was needed. These 2 pictures show you 2 things. For one, on the left, it was one of the chandeliers in the suite are original. Not many of the light fixtures were replaced. This is for certain one of the original ones that hung in the suite of rooms. And that narrow little door there to the right of the chair was actually an elevator just for the Van Sweringens, so they could go up to the bedrooms where they would stay when they spent the night there in the terminal. Today you can't go there. The elevator is no longer functional. That floor above was in, I want to say the 1970s, I think it was, turned into a suite of offices for a legal firm, and now it is not used for that anymore, of course. But still interesting to see. When they would look out of the 14th floor where they would have their business meetings, this is the view they would see. The Terminal Tower, I should say Public Square, was torn up recently to totally do a new redesign of it, and this redesign that they did in the last couple of years is the only one since the original design of the I keep saying that, of Public Square, not the terminal, but Public Square has changed only, this last time since the very beginning. The square hasn't been changed. As you see now, it is more rounded edges, so to speak. You can see the little the church. Gosh, my mind is blanking. The Old Stone Church. Old Stone Church, yeah, which is having, what is it? I think this year might be the 175th anniversary, but that is the oldest building on Public Square, and you see it just kind of dwarfed by all the bigger buildings around it. When you are up on that floor or on the observation deck, you can look to every direction, north, south, east, and west. And Tom will tell you more about the trains that serve the station. But if you visit today, you can see the views that the Van Sweringen brothers would have seen, because they wanted to understand that the trains were serving the terminal as well as could be. And they could look to the south, where the trains were important to the steel mills, as well as to the east and to the west, where it would take people like us on a trip, perhaps. There's the steel mills to the south, as they might have seen it, and then also trains that would have gone Chicago, New York, wherever your destination is. I can't get over this picture. That man is putting the finishing touches on the terminal tower. Oh man, from what I consider to be a very scary height. Amazing to think that they would have worked like that. But if you go in to the terminal tower and what we call Tower City nowadays, you will see many of the fixtures that the Van Sweringen brothers put into this structure as the train station. You see the signal board that is there still, looking very much as it might have been, and the ticket window on the left. Ticket window on the left kind of is a little double piece of history, because it has what we used to call a payphone in it. Once a ticket window, then a payphone, and today's kids would say, what's both of those? Because they wouldn't know either one. But it's kind of nice that they did preserve these gorgeous pieces of brasswork. Again, the payphones, but the handles are gone, so that would even further confuse you, but still a nice piece of our history there. When you walk through Tower City, you'll also see things like these decorative squares, were actually a part of the gates that would have welcomed you into the train station when it was just a train station. And now they're used every so often just as decoration for the area where you would go to shop or dine. When the original tower was built, really the main entrance doesn't look any different from it did in 1934 when it was finished by the Van Sweringen brothers. But it's nice to know that a lot of the original fixtures, like those light fixtures, are still hanging there the same as they did in the 1930s, as the Van Sweringen brothers chose. Of course, Tower City looks a lot different from when you might possibly remember. I could only barely remember when the trains were coming in and out of there, but the area is still the same. It just looks a bit different now with all the stores in there and the restaurants. But these fixtures that you'll see when you do walk through Tower City are original as well. They date back to 1934. You look at the decorative embellishments that are around the doorway to the various shops, and those too were there just as the Van Sweringen brothers planned. A lot of beautiful floral designs and vines, and some mythological figures as well. That I don't understand, except the connection perhaps to Old England again. This vent that you see on the left is an air vent. It'd be real easy to walk right by it and not even give a second glance to it. But this gorgeous brass are actually moths that are touching wing to wing. And I don't know how many times I walked past it and never really stared at it till I walked with the archivist and he pointed out little details like that. Again, I don't know why the Van Sweringens chose to use moths to decorate this, but it was their choice. You see the mythological figure there, which when Mr. Higbee was chosen to be the department store of choice from the Van Sweringen brothers, the very first dining hall up there in Higbee's was the Minotaur Room, if you might remember. And, I don't know if there was a connection there or not. That I can't prove one way or the other. The Van Sweringen brothers did spend the night occasionally in their suite of rooms there. However, they also had a home in Shaker Heights. It was said that, I don't know, because of their ancestry, they grew up desperately poor and they lived very simply. And although they did build this home and named it after their sister Daisy Hill, they actually shared a bedroom in the back side of the building and had twin beds side by side because they're just, you know, such fun friends and good business partners as well. For all their wealth, however, the Great Depression did come around. And in 1929, it hurt them badly. And the Great Depression caused them to be forced into bankruptcy. Loans that they had borrowed were being called in, and a lot of troubles plagued the brothers at this time. It wasn't long after an auctioneer began reading the list of securities for sale that Mantis Van Sweringen died from a heart attack in 1935 at the age of only 54. He only saw their terminal complex stand for 1 year before he passed away. His brother was so devoted to him that Oris would go into Mantis's office every morning, turn on the light, and at the end of the day, he would go back in and turn it off again. Kind of sad, but kind of sweet as well. Oris just threw himself into his work because he wanted to make a success out of what he and his brother had built. But unfortunately, their financial troubles only increased. And in February of 1936, the Van Sweringen Company, as well as some of its subsidiaries, had to file for bankruptcy. And in the end, Oris said, "I'm sorry it had to be done this way. I would rather have paid my bills." And exactly 1 year after Mantis had died, Oris died as well. Both men not living all that old, but boy, what they left us is really a legacy well worth remembering. It was in November of 1936 in a private railway car of the Nickel Plate Railway, Oris passed away. Together, they are buried side by side in Lakeview Cemetery, fitting because Lakeview is such an historic cemetery for Cleveland. But as you see, their headstone is just as plain and simple as the men were because they just didn't want to live frivolously, although what they gave to Cleveland is something very beautiful indeed. Now we're going to take a look at the trains that came in and out of the station, and I'll introduce Tom to you.
Well, while the Terminal Tower complex was being built, the Van Sweringen brothers were putting together a railroad empire. Their first acquisition was the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, also known as the Nickel Plate. As Becky alluded to, they needed a small tract of land for their Shaker Heights rapid transit. This area of land that they needed was in the area of Kingsbury Run, which is around East 79th area of Cleveland. And at first, the Nickel Plate refused to sell them the land. They just didn't want to sell it to them at all. But the brothers persisted and wound up buying the whole Nickel Plate Railroad in 1916 for $8.5 million. This was an easy acquisition for the brothers after a while because the parent company, the New York Central, owned the Nickel Plate. And at that time, the New York Central was under pressure from the government, namely the Interstate Commerce Commission and federal courts, to get rid of the Nickel Plate, divest itself because of the antitrust laws. Now, the president of the New York Central at the time was named Alfred H. Smith. He knew the government was on his back to get rid of that railroad, to get rid of the Nickel Plate. But he didn't want to just sell it to anybody because he knew if he sold it to another railroad, that could become a fierce competitor to his New York Central. So that's when the Van Sweringens came along, and he offered them the railroad, and they bought it right away. And it was also that they had done, the Van Sweringens and Alfred Smith had done some real estate deals and business deals before that, so they were kind of close business associates and friends. So Smith figured selling it to the Van Sweringens is a win-win situation for everybody involved, and that's just what they did. Now, in the following years, the Van Sweringens began acquiring other railroads. They got controlling interest of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, which later became the Chessie system. They acquired the Paramarquette system, the Erie, and the Wheeling and Lake Erie railroads. And their last railroad that they bought was the Missouri Pacific. They even bought control of the Cleveland Railway Company, which is a streetcar line. Altogether, at the height of their power, their railroad empire consisted of 27,000 miles of track and was worth, in 1929, an estimated $4 billion. That's a lot of money. But it's important to remember, as Becky pointed out, this was all bought on credit. The Van Sweringens never used their own money. What they did was they would form holding companies. And these holding companies would go to the banks and ask for a loan. And that's how they acquired these other railroads. So this money would have to be paid back with interest. The Van Sweringens had a plan to merge all these railroads, the Chesapeake and Ohio, the Pear, Marquette, Wheeling, Lake Erie, Nickel Plate, into one huge railroad. As a matter of fact, they created a group called the Advisory Mechanical Committee to standardize all design of steam locomotives and rolling stock. That was one step towards the merger plan. So you see, the Van Sweringens, they wanted more than just a train station for the terminal tower. This was to be the centerpiece, the crown jewel, if you will, of this railroad empire that they were creating in the 20s. And this shot of the terminal tower kind of shows how that centerpiece was going to look. The Van Sweringens also wanted to have a clean, smoke-free terminal for their trains. Not just a grubby old copy of the Union Station down on the lakefront. But this posed a very special problem. How do you have a clean, smoke-free train station when at the time the motive power for passenger trains were steam locomotives? Now don't get me wrong, many people, myself included, love the old steam locomotives. I think David Morgan, who was the editor of Trains magazine from 1953 to 1987, said it best when he wrote, and I quote, "If any man has invented a mechanism with just 50% of the steam locomotive's solid spiritual satisfaction, he hasn't applied for a patent yet." End of quote. Truth is, steam locomotives have many legions of devoted fans, and I see some of them in the crowd right now tonight. And anyone doubting this should see just whenever they announce that a steam locomotive is going to go through an area, see how many people show up with caps, railroad t-shirts, cameras, and video cameras, and so forth. There's quite a bit, and usually I'm in that group too. But as much as I hate to say it, steam locomotives, they're a mess. I mean, they're soot-throwing, cinder-throwing, smoke-belching machines. In short, they're kind of grubby. So they had to have a substitute for the steam locomotive, or the terminal tower would wind up being just a grubby copy of the old Union Depot down on the lakefront. So they came up with a solution, and that solution was an electrified rail line running from the west side of town through the terminal tower to the east side of town. And here's how it worked. Passenger trains coming in from Chicago would stop at the New York Central's Linndale station on the west side of town. Linndale was right around the area of West 117th and Bel Air on the west side. Linndale over the years has acquired a reputation for something else, as I'm sure you know from the newspaper, and I can attest tonight that is still the case. Linndale is about 6.35 miles from the terminal tower on the west side. Here the steam locomotive on the head end of a train coming in from Chicago would be uncoupled and replaced by an electric locomotive. Here we see there's a shot of the Linndale passenger station, June 13th, 1930. And here's another shot of the Linndale passenger train. Now, once the steam trains came in from the west, they'd be uncoupled and replaced by an electric locomotive. This was called switching the power, and so to speak. Then the train would be hauled to the terminal tower by this electric locomotive, make a stop at the terminal tower, and then proceed on to the Collinwood station. There's another shot of the Linndale Railroad facilities. And here's a shot of the Collinwood yards where the trains would eventually wind up. Now, Collinwood is the area around East 152nd and Waterloo, over on the east side. And it's about 10.5 miles east of the terminal tower. There's another shot of the Collinwood yards. Now, by the same token, trains coming in from the east, from New York, Philadelphia, Jersey City, Buffalo, and so forth, would stop at Collinwood, and the steam locomotive would be replaced by an electric locomotive, which would then pull the train to the terminal tower, make a stop, and then proceed westward to Linndale, where it would be coupled back onto a steam engine and hauled westward. My father worked at the Linndale station from about 1947 to 1951, switching the power, so to speak. And when it was required to switch the power in the evenings, he would use this electric lamp, which he gave me. It says New York Central Railroad, CUT on it, and it was battery powered. This came in handy at night because what you had to do was get in between the tender of the steam locomotive and the first passenger car, or the baggage car, uncouple it and unhitch the brake hose, and then switch it up to a electric locomotive and do the coupling process and the hoses all over again. And that came in particularly handy at night. My dad also told me a couple interesting stories about the Linndale station over the years. One concerns an engineer named Russian Mike. Dad never said if Russian Mike was Russian, or if his name really was Mike, or how he got the name in the first place. But if you were on the switching crew and that switched the power on Russian Mike's train, you got a treat. You got to go into the dining car and get 2 bottles of cold beer, which each man found that's a real treat on a hot summer afternoon, particularly in July and August. But your limit was 2, that's all you got. Needless to say, that Russian Mike was very popular among the switching crews at Linndale. But it wasn't all giggles and laughs. One cold wintry day, my dad was on a switching crew and he told me that they went between the tender and the head-end baggage car, and as they were uncoupling the train, they looked up on the back of the tender and there was a wall of ice. And in that wall of ice was a man frozen to death. Yeah. Now you might be wondering, well, how could such a thing happen? Well, you figure it this way. At various points along the line, there were track pans. Now, track pans are pools of water between the rails. There were a couple along the way. One was at Stryker, Ohio, which is just a little bit west of Toledo. Now, these track pans were about a half a mile long, and they were about 19 inches wide, about 8 inches deep. Now, as the train would approach the track pan, the locomotive would slow down to about 40 or 50 miles an hour. It would lower a scoop from the bottom of the tender, and it would scoop up about 5,000 gallons in a couple of minutes while going through the track pan. This allowed the train to pick up water and not have to make a complete stop, which would save them a lot of time. So obviously this man was riding in the back of the tender, and they hit the track pan and the guy was drenched. Now, in the summer, in July and August, that'd be pretty refreshing. All you'd have to do is lather up and wait for a rinse. And it wouldn't be a light rinse either. But in the wintertime, such a thing is deadly. Another thing he told me about was Thanksgiving weekend of 1950. The Buckeye Blizzard, as it was called. Over 22 inches of snow fell. And he said every passenger train coming into Linndale that day from the west was hours late. And conversely, all the ones coming from west from Collinwood were late too. It was just that hard of a storm. Well, as these trains were going through the Union Terminal, they had to go through a maze of switches, which I've pulled up on there, gave you a couple of minutes to look at. All of these switches were controlled by a control tower outside of the terminal tower. There we see a picture of it. This was called CT Tower. And this controlled all of the tracks and signals going in and out of the terminal tower. In fact, CT Tower controlled all of the tracks and signals between West 25th Street on the west side and East 34th Street. That's a distance of about 3.5 miles. Now this was done with a huge electromechanical interlocking machine that had 576 levers. I don't have any pictures of it that I could reproduce well, but I do have some pictures of it over in some magazines on the table, which you're welcome to look at after the program. I tried reproducing them on the flash drive and it just didn't work out very well. So I decided to just bring the magazine shots. Now, when a lever was pulled on this device, the points of the switch would move and a signal would change to let the engineer know if it was safe to proceed. And this is what those signals look like. There were just dozens of them throughout that maze of track. The electricity to power this electrified line was purchased by the Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company. The power was 11,000 volts, alternating current, or AC, and it was sent to 2 substations. One was 3.5 miles west of the terminal. The other was about 7.25 miles east of the terminal tower. At these substations, the power was converted to 3,000 volts direct current, or DC. It was then sent through wires, which were suspended above the tracks by a system of catenary supports. And these are what the catenary supports look like. They're just basically a set of steel girders placed in a concrete base. If they look familiar, they should, because many of these catenaries are still in place today, holding the wires of the RTA rapid transits. The electric locomotives, they're pretty interesting. Here's a shot of an electric locomotive. They were built by the General Electric division of the American Locomotive Works, also known as ALCO GE. And there were 22 of these built between 1929 and 1930. They were double-ended box cabs. There's another shot of one. And they had a 4-6-6-4 wheel arrangement. That meant 4 wheels on each end and then 2 sets of 6 wheels in the middle. They were 80 feet long. They weighed about 220 tons. And they could go as fast as 70 miles an hour. But usually they were cruising along at about 53 miles when they were hauling the passenger trains. They could haul a 15-car passenger train at 53 miles an hour, which is normal for them. Officially, they were referred to as the P1 class. Unofficially, the P1s were called the Juice Jacks. The engineers running them needed to take a 10-day training course. And the course consisted of 4 days of lectures on how to operate a P1. That would be classroom instruction. There would be 2 days of running the locomotive light, followed by 4 days of running the locomotive with a passenger train on the end. If you could do that, you were considered a qualified engineer, and you would get to run a P1 whenever you were needed. Now, at both ends of the line, at Linndale and Collinwood, there were inspection sheds, and here we see the one at Linndale. This is from March of 1930. There's another shot of the inspection shed. Notice there is a pit which would allow the men to go underneath the locomotive and see if there were any repairs needed, any broken pieces of equipment and so forth. There was also a walkway along the top of the wall, which would allow them to look down and see if there was anything broken equipment on the roof of the locomotive. If there were any repairs needed, they would be hauled to Collinwood, where there was another inspection shed. These electric locomotives were also inspected here at the Collinwood shop, and as I said, if they needed any repairs, that's where it was done. This repair facility at Collinwood eventually became the diesel locomotive repair facility for the New York Central Railroad and later the Penn Central Railroads. You might be wondering, here's the Linndale Roundhouse, because you might be just wondering just what happened to those steam locomotives after they were cut off from the electric locomotive. Well, a lot of them would be sent to roundhouses for repairs. And this is the Linndale Roundhouse. And here's the Collinwood Roundhouse, another shot of that. And it was here that any repairs needed to the running gear or the boilers would be made. This provided a lot of work for machinists, boiler makers, pipe fitters, and so forth. And it was hard work, because they said with a steam locomotive, it took about 3 minutes to figure out what was wrong with it, but it'd take you about 3 days to fix it, because all the operating parts are on the outside. Now the converse was true about diesels. It'd take you about 3 days to figure out what was wrong with it, 3 minutes to fix it, because all the parts that you needed were inside. But it provided a lot of work for machinists, as I said, in these roundhouses. The ones that didn't have to go to the roundhouse would be coupled onto baggage and express trains, and they would be run to the downtown post office down at the old federal courthouse. This was, you might say, their 1930s version of the Federal Express. The electrified rail line that I talked with you about, that ran from Linndale to Collinwood, was in operation from May of 1930 until November of 1953. That's almost a quarter of a century. It was owned and operated by the Cleveland Union Terminal Company. This company, in turn, was owned jointly by the Nickel Plate and the New York Central Railroads. New York Central owned 93% of the stock in Cleveland Union Terminal. The Nickel Plate owned the remaining 7%. That's why all of the P1 locomotives that were hauling these electric passenger trains were marked Cleveland Union Terminal. They weren't marked Nickel Plate or New York Central. Now, the New York Central and the Nickel Plate were the very first two railroads to operate through the terminal tower. All of the New York Central's passenger trains were hauled over this electrified rail line, except I'm told the 20th Century Limited and the New England states. These were premier trains, and they would make a stop at Cleveland's lakefront and then proceed westward onto Chicago. They didn't go through the terminal tower. The Nickel Plates passenger trains didn't use the Linndale or the Collinwood stations. Locomotive changes would be made on the Nickel Plate on the west side at West 38th Street and at East 40th on the east side of Cleveland. Once those locomotive changes would be made, they would be hauled by the electric passenger or the electric locomotives, but it was only a distance of about 5 miles from this area. In the meantime, the Nickel Plates passenger trains that were to be operating between the east and west side without the passenger trains, they would run light, and they would be switching employees between east and west sides. By the way, that junction at West 38th Street was known as Clogville. It was named after George Clogg, a very popular superintendent on the Big Four Railroad, which was a subsidiary of the New York Central. The B&O started using the Cleveland Union Terminal in about June of 1934. But they had a very short run over the Cleveland Union Terminal tracks, and that was due to how the B&O entered Cleveland. The B&O entered Cleveland through two ways. One was a set of tracks on the west side that would come over the old Cleveland, Lorain, and Wheeling line, and ran through Brookside Park by the Cleveland Zoo. And then it would end at West 3rd Street in the Flats. This section of track is still in use today. It's run by the CSX trains, so you can still see them run through there. The other approach the B&O had to Cleveland was up through the Cuyahoga River Valley. This was from Canton and Akron, and that also ended at West 3rd Street in the Flats. This section of track is still in use today. It's operated by the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad, and maybe some of you have had a chance to ride it. But once the B&O trains dead-ended in the West 3rd Street in the Flats, they would back up on an interchange freight line into the terminal, and that's where they would drop their passengers off. Now, not all of the railroads running through Cleveland used Cleveland Union Terminal. One of them was the Wheeling and Lake Erie. Here's the passenger station for the Wheeling and Lake Erie. This is dated November 22nd, 1923. Exactly 40 years before President Kennedy's assassination. This station was located at 2260 Ontario Street, around here on an Eagle Roads. It was built in 1909, and it was in an area known as Vinegar Hill. The reason it got that name was that this was in an area where there was a lot of meat packing plants, and vinegar was used in the process of meat packing in those days, so the name stuck. The Vinegar Hill station would be demolished. There's another shot from the backside. It would be demolished in 1929 to make way for the terminal tower of the Cleveland Union Terminal. After that, the Wheeling and Lake Erie rented space in the old Erie Railroad passenger station, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. They went on to build a small station at Commercial Street in 1935. I don't have a picture of it. It doesn't matter because it didn't last very long. The station was used for about 3 years, and then in 1938, the Wheeling and Lake Erie discontinued passenger service to Cleveland. The Pennsylvania Railroad was another railroad that did not use the Cleveland Union Terminal at all. It continued to use the old Union Depot, which we see a shot of here. This station had been built in 1866 at a price of $470,000. It was located at the foot of where West 6th and West 9th Street would be today. And as mentioned before, by the 1930s, it had become a pretty dingy looking station. This station, the Pennsylvania continued to use until about 1953. At that time, they transferred their passenger operations to a station on East 55th and Euclid Avenue. The old Union Depot was demolished in 1959. This station is the Erie Railroad passenger station. At first, Erie did not use Cleveland Union Terminal at all. This station was at the junction of Columbus and James Streets, which would now be about the east end of the Detroit Superior Bridge. It had been in use since 1881, and they continued to use this station until April of 1949. At that point, the Erie began using terminal tower facilities, but they didn't need the electrified locomotives because by then all of the Erie's passenger operations had been dieselized. As mentioned previously, this electrified rail line running from Linndale to Collinwood was in continuous use until 1953. By that time, diesel locomotives had taken over most, if not all, of the passenger trains that were running through Cleveland. So the P1s were no longer needed. They made their last run at Linndale on November 16, 1953. But they got a new lease on life. They got refitted with a third rail and went to serve the Grand Central Station in New York City. And they worked there until the early 1970s. At that point, all 21 remaining locomotives were scrapped and none were donated to museums. But they had a long life. Now, this electrified rail line serving the Cleveland Union Terminal, I mentioned ceased operation in 1953, but passenger trains continued to run out of the Cleveland Union Terminal, as we see here. At this point, the America's railroads were transitioning from steam to diesel, so many of the trains coming out of the terminal tower had a diesel locomotive on the head end. But there were some exceptions in the 50s. Sometimes the diesel locomotives malfunctioned or broke down, and they had to call a steam locomotive in to haul it out of the terminal. And at that time, since the electrics were gone, you'd see steam locomotives running in and out of the terminal, which was, they just didn't have any choice. Sometimes these trains were sports specials, hauled by the nickel plate for Cleveland Indians and Browns games. During the 60s and the 70s, there were several mergers among the railroads serving Cleveland. The Baltimore and Ohio merged with the Chesapeake and Ohio to form the Chessie system. The nickel plate was absorbed by the Norfolk and Western, and the New York Central merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad to form Penn Central. And the Erie Railroad merged with the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. Now, all these mergers were made to prevent bankruptcy, reduce operating costs, and fend off competition from the airlines and truck industries. But one of the biggest costs facing railroads in the 1950s were the passenger trains. Due to more and more Americans using planes and cars to reach their destinations, passenger trains had fewer riders and decreasing revenue. For every dollar raised by passenger trains, they were spending about $2 or $3 to run them. This situation couldn't go on much longer. As a result, during the 60s and 70s, you see fewer and fewer passenger trains coming out of the Cleveland Union Terminal. On December 7, 1962, the Baltimore and Ohio made its last run out of the terminal. That was the last run of the Cleveland Night Express by the B&O. After the merger with the Norfolk and Western and the nickel plate, there continued to be Norfolk and Western passenger trains going out of the terminal, but that stopped in September 10, 1965. The Penn Central, which I mentioned was formed by the union of the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads, they ran about 7 passenger trains out of the Cleveland Union Terminal during their brief existence. Penn Central only lasted 2 years, and they made their last passenger train run out of the terminal in April of 1971. Amtrak briefly operated some passenger trains out of the terminal from May to December of 1971. The last passenger train to run out of the Cleveland Union Terminal was the old Erie Lackawanna. It was trains number 29 and 28. They made their daily runs between Cleveland and Youngstown during the late 60s, early 70s. The 1 hour, 50-minute trip made 13 stops along a 66-mile trip between the Cleveland and Youngstown. This is basically a commuter train, but it too fell victim to the times, made its last run on January 14, 1977. It marked the end of an era. From then until now, there's the Erie. From then until now, the only trains running in and out of the terminal are the RTA and Shaker Rapids. So that concludes my part of the program for tonight. I want to thank the library for its invitation to come here and for your polite attention. And before I open the floor to questions, just want to remind you as you leave here to go to your homes this evening, just remember what Broderick Crawford used to say at the end of every highway patrol. If you care to drive, drive with care. So thanks again.